thanks for having me here. It's nice to be in the Aquaman Theatre. I was actually hoping for kind of more Bohemian Rhapsody, but you get what you get and you don't make a fuss. And that's what I was meant to sign up to talk about, which is how to measure growth at each stage of your company. And I've been investing in SaaS for 20 plus years. I've been in venture for 25 years, so hopefully something's sunk in. But I will admit the first response when you see this thing is, oh my God, what a boring topic. Yet another SaaS KPI presentation. I'm not sure I can do it. I'm impressed that you guys are willing to sit through it. I was barely willing to write it. And what I did when I started thinking about what's going on is, how do you add, I mean, it is 20 years since Salesforce was founded. How can there be something left to say about subscription businesses KPIs? And what can be left at this stage to talk about? And what I realized was, in fact, the best way to say something useful and additive was to be subtractive. In other words, because the issue really that you see when you kind of talk about SaaS KPIs is not that people don't know KPIs. It's that there's an infinite number of KPIs to measure growth, to measure churn, to measure all the different things you care about as a SaaS investor. And what you realize is all of these are actually reasonably useful. But the sum total of all these useful things is a total pain in the ass and a total failure to communicate, because everyone has slightly different metrics. No one really understands them. If I'm honest, the number of times I've sat in board meetings, and you can see there's 6 or 7 partners and board members around the table talking about a metric, and deep in my gut, I know that half of us couldn't define what that metric is. But we continue to bluff, because that's what you do when you're a venture investor. So what I decided to do is try and actually distill and make something simpler. And what I realized is a good metaphor for what I'm trying to do is the idea of vital signs in the ER room. And we've all know what the vital signs in the ER room are. We've all either been in the ER room if you're unlucky, or let's be honest, you watch it on TV, kind of any of those doctor programs where you see him kind of dashing the body into the operational room and someone screaming, blood pressure 20/70, heart rate 17. And what you realize is in the ER, there are very clear set of vital signs. There are 4 vital signs. There's kind of heart rate, there's pulse, there's lung/respiratory rate, and if I could remember the last one, I probably would have been a doctor. I can't. But they remember them, and that's the point, right? Everyone knows what they are. Everyone knows what good is. I mean, the things you simply don't hear in those kind of situations is, hey, doctor, how are you defining heartbeat? That's just not a thing, right? You also don't hear, doctor, do you think that's a good number? Again, it's not the way it happens, because when someone's trying to make a quick diagnosis, what they want to know is exactly what's going on and assess the data relatively quickly. And it's almost exactly the opposite today when you're kind of trying to assess progress at any of these SaaS companies. You just literally have this cacophony of stuff, and it's just so hard to figure out what's what and what matters and how you weight them. And the truth is, if you measure many things, you're really measuring no thing, right? And the whole trick is to try and distill what really matters in all these companies in such a way as to be both clear on the definition, and I would argue even more importantly, to be able to correctly compare them across companies, because that's really what you want to know at the highest level. Back to the vital signs analogy, this person's heart rate is X and 99.9% of the population's heart rate is Y, we probably have a problem here, right? That's the kind of information you need out of the gate. It's not to say that later on you won't want to dive deeper, but out of the gate you want to say, can I put this company into context on many other companies to see how it's doing? So that's what I'm going to try and do. And I think the first thing is, and by the way, the clock hasn't started yet, so I'm not sure you want to handle the time. I'll take what I get and won't make a fuss, but you just wanted to be aware. Oh, 17, now it's 16, 15, now you're turning on me. Right? Sorry, I just lost 5 minutes of my life there. Okay, so, and now he's turned it off. Oh, I really pissed him off. I'm willing to say sorry. I really am. I can keep going. Okay, my God, they turn on you, they turn on you. So anyway, I think there's really only 4 things that matter in SaaS, which are kind of up here. It's, first of all, your basic revenue growth, which is the kind of non-negotiable. It's the first thing we look at as a venture investor. Do you want me to come over? And the second thing is sales efficiency, which is how you measure how well a company converts sales and marketing expense into revenue out. The third thing is churn, and the fourth thing is cash burn. I believe that these are the 4 vital signs of SaaS. If these things are on track, everything else is kind of a one level down problem. It's kind of like these are the macro numbers that you need to understand in your company or in any subscription business to see how you're doing. So let's talk about each of these 4 numbers. So And I would say, obviously, by the way, I would pause at this stage and say this kind of deep definition stuff, I don't expect, even if you, first of all, if you're not interested, I totally respect that. If you are interested, it's nice to take a photo. But not this week, because we couldn't get it done for technical reasons, but probably within 2 weeks, we're going to put all this and the backup information you'll see in a few minutes on our website, and you're more than welcome to download it and take a look. So what we've done here is explicitly defined each of the 4 key vital signs of SaaS. And there's no one answer for all these definitions. I mean, I was doing revenue growth there, and I spent a little time on that. I can comfortably come up with 27 different ways to define revenue growth. Trailing or forward, year-on-year or Q-on-Q, ARR, R, GAAP revenue, and you can just go on. And so you just got to pick a number. You got to pick an approach. And what I've kind of just, on revenue growth, we've looked at just year-on-year GAAP revenue. It's very simple. On sales efficiency, we've used a metric that we defined many years ago, which is magic number, which is the change in GAAP revenue over the sales and marketing expense. And again, in the post, I'll explain, because it's too tedious to do here, how that tracks this basic sales efficiency. Revenue churn is pretty obvious why it matters. It matters because ultimately, revenue growth and sales efficiency start the arc of the company up. Churn is what drags you down at scale. You can ignore it early on a little bit because you can power through, but eventually the customers you have and their impact dominates over the customers you're going to get, and then churn really starts to kill you at scale. And then the obvious 4th KPI, the obvious 4th vital signs, which is really the equivalent of literally heart rate, is cash burn, because if you don't have cash burn, obviously nothing else matters if you run out of money. So those are the vital signs. And I think the interesting thing is, just by taking these very simple metrics, what we've been able to do, and kind of simplifying, at scale, we've kind of been in business for our predecessors. I've been there for 25 years. We started looking at SaaS companies in late '99. And what we've built is a database of literally 300 plus companies that we've seen invested in over the last 20 plus years. And we have my partner, Dale Chang, kind of introduced a concept called Steel Studio, which means anyone, including anyone here, can go online and benchmark their company against that database. And what you're seeing here is the output from that data. And it's, as I say, it's 300 plus companies. And I cannot emphasize the importance of this, because one of the things that I know that we as venture capitalists do that must be intensely infuriating to being an entrepreneur is we give you anecdotal data. You aren't going fast enough because, hey, I'm in Slack and they grew 10x last year. Well, whoop-de-doo, we're not Slack. You caught me, right? But the point is, that's not really that actionable, because I think you'd know if you were Slack and you'd know if you're not Slack. It's not something you're going to miss here. The real question is, how am I doing relative to the broad mass of companies, and how acceptable is this growth rate? And what we're able to do here is literally look the entrepreneur in the eye and say, here, at every level of growth, at every level is, not 1, not 2, but 50, maybe 100 data points, depending on the size, on what companies can do. And what you see here are the first 2 vital signs. And the story is exactly what you'd expect. For revenue growth, you see the inexorable trend is revenue growth trails down as revenue stage increases. It's exactly what you'd expect. We've blogged a little bit of how that happens fairly persistently, so you can just get a sense of revenue decline as you get to scale. And we'll talk in a little bit about the Mendoza line, the bare minimum of growth you need to do a deal with someone like us. Sales efficiency, magic number, interestingly, doesn't tend to change all that much. Very quickly, beyond $5 million, you kind of settle into your distribution economics. And I'll talk a little bit later about how it can be changed. But the big picture thing we've learned is it's incredibly hard to change. Businesses, like people, are what they are at a very early age. I have teenagers. It's unchangeable at this stage. Business dynamics, company dynamics, competitive dynamics tend to settle in a fairly narrow band and tend to be fairly hard to move or change at scale. Churn, on the other hand, again, slightly different message here. What you see is that early on you can have high churn. As you can see, the 25th percentile, the low end of performance, has almost 10% churn. But here, Darwin has his wicked way. And basically, those people don't get to 5 million. They definitely don't get to 10 million. And what you see is a typical convergence of churn on that high-end 20% annualized, 5% a quarter. Low-end gross churn pretty low, and net churn strongly positive. And then the last set of numbers are operating income, and it's exactly what you'd expect, kind of burn convergence, especially as a percentage of revenue as you get to scale, even though the absolute numbers can still be quite high. So, whole bunch of data, and the power of this data is not that there was anything wildly surprising about any one of the data points, but it's allowed you to be grounded in a set of facts where you can look at your team in the eye, you can look at your board in the eye and say, this is the range of what's doable, and this is how we compare to it. And I'll give you about 6 or 7 takeaways from this. And why the number 7? The honest answer on the number 7 is because that's all I had. I ran out of juice. It's kind of an odd number, but 10 was just too ambitious. So, and I'll cover each of them at scale here, right? One is the inevitable Jack Nicholson quote, which I'll come back to. The second is the focus on growth. The third is the idea of this Mendoza line for growth, the level below which you just aren't relevant in a venture sense, and I'll talk about that. Then the fourth is how I think about what the right metrics are to talk about sales, kind of company efficiency, and why. Fifth is one of the few ways we've been able to change kind of this distribution economics, which is around sales hiring. And then I'll talk a little bit about the churn metric, and then finally the burn metric. And what I'm trying to do here, as we're halfway through the presentation, is just give you a sense of what my takeaways from that prior set of data was on vital signs. What do I think matters? What's worth knowing at this point in time? And I've decided, I hate this quote, and I put it in, so shame on me. And I'll tell you why I hate it. It's actually a tone thing. Yeah, I mean, if you've seen the movie, he was pretty much of an ass at that point in time. In fact, pretty consistently an ass, arguably, for much of his career. But this is not a movie commentary, right? I think that you can't handle the true tone is the wrong one. Actually, I've decided to kind of up-tier it a little bit and go for T.S. Eliot, where he said, humankind cannot bear very much reality. And that's the same quote put a little bit nicer, right? The point is this. Benchmarking is really brutal because suddenly you end up and go, oh, we are only at 25th percentile on churn. We are among the 25% that is worst in terms of our performance on this metric. And it's really hard as an entrepreneur to look at that, and we all do this. I mean, it's hard for us when we pitch our funds and say, hey, we're a 50th percentile fund. No one likes to say that. Thankfully, we're not. But the point is, you naturally pull away. The instinctive reaction, whenever you unveil this information to someone who's got a so-so number, is to argue about the definition. It's almost axiomatic. You show someone something, you show them they're low down in terms of metrics, and they'll instantly get caught in a conversation about how it's really not the right metric. And stepping back, my advice is this, and it's hard advice to take, is look at the metric. One of the reasons we put so much effort into simplification, comparability, frankly, sacrificing precision at times for comparability and simplicity is we can look the entrepreneur in the eye and say, not obnoxiously, but on this metric, you really are 25th or 50th percentile. And rather than bitching and moaning about how it's not the right metric, we should think about how you change that dynamic. The second takeaway is this. The first most important metric for venture folks is growth. I cannot emphasize that enough. And it's interesting in the context of this conversation that's been going on, that New York Times article on, people turning down venture, people, you're correctly saying there's different ways to grow businesses. Yes, there are. And what I'm deliberately, again, trying not to be a jerk here is, what I'm not saying is, hey, these kind of businesses are good and these kind of businesses are bad. But what I can say with precision is this. If you're interested in attracting venture capital, there is a trajectory on growth rate that's non-negotiable. Right? And because our model doesn't work, and that's why I joke, I say, it's not you, it's me, right? Your model, those articles are correct. Your model can go perfectly fine, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million in revenue. I've been an entrepreneur, I know how hard that is. I don't mock that at all. But it doesn't work for our model. Because, to a rounding error, venture capitals, being as we are upside junkies, means the primary value of any $1 to $10 million ARR company, this sounds very cold, I just look at it as the option value to being $100 million. There's no value at a meaningful venture level in a small company. The only thing that matters is that we go into that deal with the upside to be able to be a $100 million outcome. And that's a different mindset. We're not fully aligned. What that means, as the New York Times article correctly said, 90% plus of companies aren't right for venture. It's our job to make sure we do the ones that are. But it's your job, if you want to raise venture, and in particular, if you put yourself in a position with your cash position where you need to raise venture, at that point, it becomes your job to understand how we think, because you put yourself in a position of needing to understand how we think. That was a mistake. And what you end up with here is this is concept that we've said, and we've blogged about this, that there is a Mendoza line, and this is a baseball term, Mario Mendoza. Wikipedia defines it as the threshold of baseball incompetence. In other words, the point of time at which, below which, in terms of batting average, you're simply not worth hiring. And therefore we say there is a revenue growth rate below which
most ventures, it'll be extraordinarily hard to do business, and it'll be extraordinarily hard to raise venture money. And as you'd expect, that growth rate changes at scale, because what would be top quartile growth rate at $50 million isn't even relevant at $10 million. You have to go a lot faster because of the nature of that curve. And you can see, and proof of that curve works is, this is a chart showing what we call that Mendoza line. And again, a lot of this is on our blog. I gotcha. And this is literally the annual dots of growth rate and revenue scale for all the SaaS IPOs for the last 3 years. And what you see very clearly is this curve is a thing, right? And the practical reality is venture folks, this is what they're looking for, and this is the kind of growth rates we need to see. And it's interesting, at 50 or 20 or $30 million, how fast do you actually have to be growing to attract venture capital? It's pretty predictable. And we published this about a year ago. And I always say, it's not that we discovered something new, it's that we were able to crystallize a rule of thumb that every venture person who's been successful has in their head implicitly. At $10 million, if you're not doubling, it's probably not going to work. At $50 million, you can kind of get that 50% growth rate. In between, it adjusts. Let's talk about, those are the first 3 takeaways. Let's talk about 1 or 2 more. This is the idea of talking about kind of sales efficiency, CAC to LTV. The truth is this, and I'll say it in the next slide. Software fundamentally at scale is a distribution business. The first $10 million goes on R&D, and the next $90 million goes on distribution. So the distribution economics of your business are the #1 thing that determines how successful it will be. You see a lot of this LTV to CAC ratio, right? And I think it's one of those things, I'm just not a fan of it, and here's why. It's a very logically correct approach. And what you see here is the calculation literally just for the LTV that a very smart, talented blog on the venture industry put out, where you get your average revenue times gross margin, times 1 over a constant, times the growth rate. And all you can say when you look at that is you've never tried to explain that as a sales kickoff. Because, again, back to the vital signs, it's only useful to help you run your business. If you could look, a room like this, and I've done sales kickoffs like this, where there's 200-300 people in the room, and say, look, this is where we have to get to. And the beauty of this kind of sales efficiency metric, which is the same as the magic number, is all we're doing is we're saying, this is what you spent in sales and marketing dollars, and this is what you got in net new ARR. And the ratio between the two, if you're above 0.7, you're okay. If you're 1, you're awesome. If you're 0.5 or below, it's not going to work at scale, because you're just going to take, you can build a company, but it's going to take so much capital to get there, it's going to be hard. So I'm going to skip this. It's really hard to change sales efficiency. We've discovered that, as I say, these projections tend to get locked at scale, and it's very hard to change the economics of your business. One of the few ways we've learned you can is a really tilting of the ratio of sales reps versus non-sales rep. A classic error we see is in startups at 10 million or so is you spend so much time hiring all the adjunct people who help the salespeople sell. It turns out to be absolute rubbish. What you actually need are salespeople who will sell. And we have a kind of mental rule of thumb. If 10 to 15% of your total headcount aren't quota-bearing sales reps, you're probably not investing enough in distribution. I think the last one I'll cover is just kind of gross churn. I feel very strongly that in the 4 vital signs, kind of the net sales efficiency totally works fine. It's arguably all you need to know. Churn is a bitch to measure, right? Because there's a huge amount of complexity around retention, around multi-year. I kind of started to write a blog post on churn and just gave up in despair, right? Again, I would say these numbers are roughly right, and what you need to do on churn is go 1, 2, 3 levels deeper. And I think beyond the numbers, I think there's a reality in the business beyond the numbers, and it's this. You need to have some, my friend Mamoon, who's now at Kleiner, points out, a North Star, a non-financial metric of customer engagement. You need to know what good customers do with your software, how well they do it, and what that looks like, and how well the rest of your company, how well the rest of your customers are doing. And it's actually much harder to do than you'd think. I mean, the obvious bland answer is total usage, days, DAO, or MAU. Turns out not to be that relevant all the time. In some cases it is, like a Slack. But for people like DocuSign, where I was on the board, people didn't use it for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, but when they had to sign something, they did. And, retention was amazing. So it's not actually just always usage. Sometimes it could be something like manager usage. This sounds really grim, but there are some products that managers love and, frankly, employees don't love. And from a churn perspective, what you discover very clearly is if the manager's using it, adoption stays strong, and if the manager's not using it, it's out of there, right? Sometimes it's something like usage it's different kinds of use cases have massively different churn profiles. You know, we've seen one in my company Box that you mentioned here. When they're using us for complex business content management, we have astonishingly great performance. And obviously, way back when we were just selling simple file sync or share, it was much less sticky. So this is one where the vital signs approach is totally wrong. Everyone has their own vital signs. So stepping back, because I'm getting the cutoff signal, and I'll take questions outside. Big picture here is, in SaaS, keep it simple. Identify 4 vital signs that drive your business. We've done that exercise. They mightn't be the only ones you want to see, but the beauty of these 4 vital signs is on our website now and over the next couple of weeks, you can compare your company to 300 other companies, similar stages, and just get a sense of how you're doing. And with that, I'll stop abruptly, and I don't think I'll even be allowed any questions. Am I correct? Are we done? We're done. Thank you all.